This is the presentation of Chapter 6, Law, done by Group 3. This chapter is divided in 5 sections: the law undetermined by networks, who rules the internet, information and communication freedom, intellectual property rights, and the right to privacy. We will first start with the law undetermined by networks. In almost every period in history, justice and law have failed to keep up with new technology. The reason behind this is because new technology must become established in society before legislation can be applied to it. Thus, the consequences of new technology are not always visible immediately. Moreover, justice in general and legislation in particular fails increasingly in keeping up with information and communication technology development. But to solve the legal problems of the online environment in a fundamental way, new legislation must be designed not depending on certain technologies and their characteristics, but on basic principles of law in contemporary constitutional states. In combining these principles, legislators could prepare framework legislation that covers a broad range of laws. Once a country agrees on the framework, concrete laws can be developed. Moving on to who rules the internet, this section will show that there is an aggressive struggle going on between governments, corporate, technological, and self-regulatory control of the internet. When compared to the regulation of older media such as broadcasting, the press, and telecommunication, comparisons show that the regulation of the internet has more in common with the press model and the telecommunication model than with the broadcasting model. As the internet combines both public and private communication, it looks like the press model when considering public communication and like telecommunications model considering private communication. The access of senders has always been controlled by governments and regulatory committees. But as mentioned, the internet looks like a relatively free press model because publication of internet content is just as open as that of press media and because this content is scarcely controlled by media law. However, contrary to the press, the internet meets with high infrastructure regulation and access limitations for receivers. As it is also used for private communication, it would have to offer the same level of protection as telephony. But internet regulation is weak. There is no strong or personal protection as emails are less protected than telephone calls.
We will be discussing Internet governance, thus, it is essential to define the term. Internet governance is the development and application by governments, the private sector, and civil society in their respective roles of shape principles, norms, rules, decision-making, procedures, and programs that shape the evolution and use of the Internet. Furthermore, Solom distinguishes 5 models of Internet governance: self-regulation by the Internet community, software code and Internet architecture, transnational institutions, traditional legislation by governments, and market regulations. The image below gives an indication of the competitors and their types of governance according to Lessig, who has listed similar constraints. Lessig's model is further discussed. First, there are governments and their legal control. Legislation has only weak direct control on the Internet. Control is confined to national jurisdiction, making it difficult for governments to forge Internet agreements so they can rule the Internet flows of information and communication across borders. The major part of new legislation addresses actors such as Internet service providers, hardware producers, and software agencies. Despite all limitations, governments can be effective in imposing their will outside their jurisdiction. For example, the US gives fair credits to foreign judgments and verdicts unless they are contrary to US policy. Less democratic governments try to apply control on free internet exchange by surveying and filtering suspected oppositional sources by their security agencies themselves. This includes ordering or requesting ISPs and web organizations to continually screen the internet for specific contents to filter and block oppositional sites, blogs, social media, and email messages. Then there are internet communities and self-regulation. The internet has no central organization. However, it started as a decentralized network for academics and for the American Department of Defense and Commerce. The most important organization, the Internet Engineering Task Force, takes care of the internet protocols such as ICP, IP, and other standards. The second most important organization is the Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers. They decide what domain names and IP addresses can be used and register these names worldwide. The third organization is the Internet Society. This is intended to be the future government or United Nations of the global Internet community. Most countries in the world currently have such an Internet society. The ISOC deals with all policy aspects of the Internet concerning technical, juridical, economic, and tax issues, and advises national governments on these issues. The mission of these self-regulatory bodies is to work only in the interest of the Internet and its users. Then we have corporations and market control. The rise of e-commerce requires secure payments and conditional access. The increasing criminal abuse of the Internet makes government want to reduce freedom of information, communication, privacy, and personal autonomy, both in the general and the business sense. Therefore, the big players on the Internet such as Microsoft, Google, Apple, and Facebook try to control what happens on the Internet to support their business strategies in the long term. They do this by trying to sell their own types of software, social media, mobile phone apps, tablets, and so forth. This leads to a strong influence on the type of activities of the Internet users. Nevertheless, one of the wonderful things about the Internet is that it offers cheap and sometimes even free means of production for everyone who has the skills, a computer, and an Internet connection to start one's own business.
The architecture of the Internet is the central nervous system of this network defining its character. This architecture is very important. It consists of network layers and control instruments. But first, let me explain the first most important layers. There are several layers. The first and most important one is the physical layer. This gives all kinds of options to connect tablets, phones, PCs, and other digital media and to get access to them. Network is built into these devices, like via smart cards, for example. Next up is the data link layer. This enables computers to talk to each other. Then there is the network and transport layer, and this is the Internet as we know it. Without this layer, the anonymous, decentralized exchange of information would be impossible. Furthermore, there is a session layer. This is where governments and other private parties try to control Internet traffic. They rely on the codes of the session layer. These codes enable user identification and message authentication. This is mostly for security. Next, we have the presentation layer. At this layer, the user is able to hide Internet messages using encryption. Then there is another session layer. This is where a new type of control instrument appears. Here, every session is moved, organized, and stored on central computers. Lastly, there is an application layer, where numerous other instances of software control of the Internet can be discussed. Van Dijk made an extension on a model made by Milton Muller explaining the political spectrum of Internet governance in two dimensions, national and transnational based on network versus hierarchy. The decentralized dimension of networking is the rule of the Internet that can be realized by producers and users themselves in market control or self-regulation by individual users and user groups. The hierarchical dimension, on the other hand, is where networks have centers, embodied by the government and big businesses. The axis of the national versus transnational government addresses the question to what extent the globalizing Internet should be kept under the control of nation-states. The four political positions on Internet rules are denationalized liberalism, global governability, networked nationalism, and cyber conservatism. Citizens' right to information and communication freedom have been established in constitutions of democratic states as the Declaration of Human Rights. Having mentioned that, the logical thing would be that freedom to receive expression should be protected as well. Constitutions are momentarily not clear about this legal principle. There is mainly protection against government interference, but not against institution by private conduct. Information and communication freedom is not an absolute right. At the individual level, one person's freedom of speech and right to reception ends where another person's right to privacy, security, identity, and dignity's interest begins. At state level, the right to entirely free information traffic conflicts with a state's right to sovereignty. So next up, there are also problems implementing information and communication freedom rights. We're going to describe some legal aspects. First, there is the legal sphere. This is where international networks can be instruments to evade national legislation. These are extremely fast file transfers from one country to another in the cheapest way, avoiding taxes. Second, we have the economic sphere. States usually miss out on income because taxes are imposed only on data carriers and not on the content and the production of these data, which are worth more than the carriers. Thirdly, we have the political sphere. This contains the exclusive use of information which can be of great interest to a country. Fourth, we have the military importance. This closely relates to a country's important information sovereignty, closely related to the political. And fifth, we have the cultural identity. This relates to the poor or less developed countries. The adaptation of legislation and regulation related to ICT is necessary but very difficult. It is difficult to cross jurisdictions by the internet. It can only be solved by international agreements and cooperation, for example with child pornography. Some governments have therefore adopted emergency legislation. Two cases did this. The first one is Communications Decency Act. The aim of adopting this act was to limit access to and prosecute offenses in expressions of violence and obscenity on cable broadcasting. The second one was the Child Online Protection Act. The court stressed the right of freedom of interpersonal communication on the internet as protected by the First Amendment. The emergency legislation adopted in the last 15 years has often led to more restrictions on information and communication freedom in the new online world and in the offline old world. Next up, there are some self-regulation solutions. Very simple, there are only two self-regulating solutions. The first one is blacklisting, and the second one is blocking. These methods are the favorite way for governments to block unwanted content from countries outside its jurisdictions. Then we have technical solutions. The technical solution is Lex Informatica. It would be able to solve most problems by technological means, such as encryptions and other codes of protection.
Information and communication freedom does not only clash with rightful personal and societal interests, but also with rights of ownership, meaning intellectual property rights. These are creations of the mind, such as inventions, symbols, and more. The latter conflict is harder to resolve than the former. This is because people consider information to be a social product that should not be exclusively appropriated by private interests. Additionally, networks simplify and expand the possibilities for exchanging and duplicating knowledge. Knowledge in networks is at the disposal of numerous users without losing any quality or intellectual value. Without doubt, networks add to the socialization of knowledge. This makes it harder to protect the ownership of knowledge passed on in networks. Businesses with intellectual property have developed new business models to earn on content. These are considered as self-regulatory solutions. The models are the advertising model, which is the most important solution. Service providers on the internet offer content that apparently does not have to be paid for. However, users do pay in two ways. They must sell part of their privacy because the providers want personalized advertisement, or they have to digest a lot of advertisement. The partly free and partly pay model gives users many things for free, but they must pay for valuable extra content or service. Then there is the online is free, but offline and physical products have to be paid for model. For instance, these days the pop music business earns less from record selling than from concerts, t-shirts, and other kinds of merchandising. The pay-for-value model is the ideal model for the copyright industry. For instance, quality newspapers now ask for subscription and single-issue payments. However, it might be that only those who can afford this or really need this are willing to pay for it. These are not the only business models in use. It is also possible to earn from public domain software, freeware, and shareware, which are freely available. Public domain software, also known as open code, is free for distribution and free for change. An example is operating system Linux. Freeware, also known as open source, means that the source code of the software must be made available to other users but not necessarily free of charge. Shareware is software that is free until it is actually used. This means that after it has been used, a license must be obtained. We will now continue to the final section, which is the right to privacy. Most countries have a national privacy law. This legislation is often guided by the 8 principles formulated by the OECD and the European Council. The following 4 are the most important. The use limitation principle, meaning the smallest possible amount of personal data should be gathered and used for the purpose given. The principle of purpose specification, meaning only personal data for strictly specified purposes should be collected and processed. Quality, meaning the personal data must be correct, complete and up to date, and they must be well protected by means of security. The principle of transparency or openness, meaning the people involved have the right to know what personal data are collected, to what purpose, who has access to the data, what will happen to these data when they are passed on to others, and to whom they are passed on. The following trends make privacy protection more and more difficult. A. Privacy threats have become ubiquitous and more intrusive because our whole electronic environment is packed with technologies touching informational, rational, and physical privacy. B. The growth of the internet and mobile telephony globalized the transfer of personal data across jurisdictions. C. The technological advance of data mining has led to a level of profiling and social sorting that turns data subjects into mere numbers unable to defend themselves. And D. The rise of social media and user-generated content has multiplied the amount of personal data created and exchanged. Just like in previous sections, there are self-regulatory solutions. In this case, there is the distinction between individual or collective self-regulatory solutions. Individual solutions are measures taken by privacy-conscious Internet users to protect themselves, such as in-private navigation, removing browser histories, and all kinds of protection against spyware. There are also search engines and SNSs that do not store IP addresses. Collective solutions are voluntary offers by organizational websites. Best known are privacy statements drafted on the initiative of these websites. Second are privacy codes of conduct that are the result of negotiations with organizations of consumers, employees, and privacy commissioners. Third are the professional codes drafted by medical staff, social workers, researchers, consultants, and information service providers. These instruments can be quite effective, but to support their effectiveness, they should be backed and sometimes enforced by legislation. This concludes our video. Thank you for watching.